Does inexpensive mean cheap? We're going to find out. In front of me, I have a set of T7 coilovers for the 05 to 14 Mustang sent out to me by MaXpeeding Rods. They wanted me to do an install and review, so that's what I'm going to do for you guys. And let's get this thing opened up, see what we're working with. So right off the bat, the packaging is actually pretty nice. I was kind of pleasantly surprised in that regard. So when you open it up, everything seems to be, like I said, packaged well in its own individual bags and whatnot. This one I've already taken out because I just wanted to get a sneak peek of everything. But let's go ahead and get it all out of the packaging and look at the individual components and see what all comes with this kit. Alright, so again, just going off of initial impressions, as far as the build quality goes, that also looks really good in my opinion. So all of the powder coating looks nice and consistent. It's not flaking or scratched off or messy. All of the welds seem to be nice and clean. There's laser etched logos and everything on the base of the struts and shocks. And on the front struts, they have some camber plates installed with a nice laser etched logo there. And as you can see, all of these struts and the shocks are 24-way valve adjustable for softness and hardness of your ride. Also adjustable are going to be these sway bar end links that come with the kit. And then we have our rear spring perches, and I believe these are going to be the rear isolator spring isolator bushings. And then of course the ride height of the front struts and the rear springs and everything is going to be adjustable as well. So again, initial impressions, so far so good, but now it's time to start getting everything put on the vehicle for the true test.
Obviously, first things first, you're going to need to get the vehicle up off the ground. If you do not have a low profile jack, what I did was I made a 2-piece wooden ramp. There's only one piece in the frame at the moment, but I put that under each of the 4 corners to bring the whole vehicle up, so that way after everything was lowered, I'd have a little bit of extra clearance to get my jack back out again. After getting your wheel and tire off, you can go ahead and start with the caliper first. It's going to be 2 18mm bolts, although yours could be a 15 just depending on the production run of your vehicle. And then just support it on the frame off to the side. I just used a bungee cord to do this, but whatever works for you is fine. Get the rotor off, and then you're just looking at the sway bar end links. So that's an 18mm nut, and I'm using an 8mm on the inside stud to help get that backed off. Then I'm just going to loosen my brake lines up from where it attaches to the shock and loosen up the bolts on the knuckle holding it to the shock, and I'll come back and remove those after I take some tension off of the whole system on the top strut mounts. So then here I'm just taking those nuts off the top. That will allow me to have some wiggle room to move the shock around. Unplugging my ABS wire, and then this is a camber bolt on the top, so it won't just kind of back out. You have to kind of knock it out there. The one on the bottom should be a little bit more straightforward as far as just backing it out. With those out though, and the 4 nuts removed from the top, you can go ahead and take out the whole coilover assembly.
With that stock coilover out, we can line up the 2 parts and compare them. Right now I have this adjusted to where this is roughly 3 inches shorter with respect to the distance between the knuckle mount and the top hat. So I'll put this in the vehicle like this, see where everything kind of settles and compresses to see what we're working with ride height wise. I have about 1.5 inches here of adjustment to make it lower. There's plenty of room this way to make it taller. So we'll just, like I said, get that on there and see kind of how it settles and how it looks. Before I do that though, I mentioned that these have a camber plate on them. Couple things for you. One, you will want to adjust this to where the adjustment knobs are going to be perpendicular to your driving position. So if that way is the headlights, for example, I'm in the driver's seat, I want these to be in this orientation here with the logo facing out toward the side of the vehicle. One thing with these though, at least on the Mustang, The opening in the coil bucket is going to be too small to actually access these after the fact, so you can't actually do any adjustments while it's on the vehicle. So before I even install these, I'm going to need to get a hole saw and open that opening up just a little bit more so I can be able to access those fasteners. Again, that's on the Mustang. Double check your vehicle if that's something that you'll need to do. Go ahead and make sure that you make plans and arrangements to do that. Well, that didn't work at all. So that hole saw was just not cutting it, no pun intended. What I ended up doing was taking an angle grinder and just lopping off the top little dome shape, and that ended up giving me an opening about what I needed. So there's the cut modified side compared to the stock side. So right here where it just starts to kind of ramp up, that's where I made that cut, and the opening might be a little bit smaller than what I need, but I think it will end up working just fine. Worst case scenario, I go with like a Dremel drum and just kind of open it up just a little bit more. One thing, if you are going to be doing that, I put down a wet towel because you don't want to be slinging sparks, you know, all over everything under the engine compartment, especially if you happen to have any kind of, you know, fuel vapor fumes or anything like that. So be cautious if that's what you're doing, but that's what I ended up having to do to get that, and then I just ended up painting the bare metal so I don't have any kind of rust issues.
For the install, I'm just putting these top 4 nuts on snug for right now. I'll torque them after the strut tower brace gets put on. And the install is just the reverse of the removal, except for this sway bar end link. It's going to take a 7mm Allen on the inside instead of a 8mm socket on the outside. And all of this needs to go for an alignment, so for right now I'm just getting it installed. It will get adjusted later.
So I've already gone ahead and made use of these camber plates. I loosened these up and pushed everything basically to max camber because after I got the wheel and tire on, there was some poke up at the top, and this is max droop. We are not supported by anything, and there is 2 5/8 inches here, so I didn't want to lower this down and then crunch my fender. For comparison, again, this is 2 5/8, and then on the other side we've got 6 inches here. So, and this isn't even as low as I could get it. There's more I could play with, but already this is looking like it's going to be quite low. I may have to actually raise it up a bit, but we'll have to get it on the ground to know for sure. Moving to the rear, we'll open up the trunk and move the carpeting trim out of the way to access the top of our shocks. So this is going to be a 15mm. We'll just take all that off, and the new kit has a top washer and bushing, so we don't need to keep this. Then, if you still know where your 10mm is, you'll use it to take off this bracket. We're going to need to drop the axle down, so we don't want our brake lines to get bound up when doing so. Then with our 15mm, we're going to take off this bolt for the rear sway bar, and we're going to do it on both sides. We're going to need to drop these links down to move the sway bar out of the way to access the bolt for our shock. With both of those out, move your sway bar link, drop everything down. And this next part isn't part of the kit, but if you are doing this on a Mustang, anytime you lower the vehicle, you're going to need to swap out your panhard bar for one that's adjustable to recenter the rear axle. After you lower it, everything is going to basically jut out to one side, and this allows you to bring everything back in. So again, this isn't included in the kit. I did go ahead and buy one just because I knew that that was a thing. So again, if you have something that has a solid rear axle like the Mustang, you're going to want to do this too so that you can get that rear end squared back up. This is just going to be a 19mm, and there's one bolt on this side and then one bolt on the other. Then use your 15mm to go ahead and get the lower shock mount bolt out. And then the shock should just drop out with a little pull.
When it comes to getting these rear springs out, you're going to need to just raise up the body of the vehicle itself until there's enough pressure taken off of that spring that you can pull it out. And I tried using the isolator bushings that came with the kit, but I could not get them to fit over the notch on the axle. I used heat, I used some grease, and it just wasn't working out for me. So what I ended up doing was just reusing what was there from the factory, and that ended up working out for me. We'll see if there's issues down the line, but just FYI, that's what I did.
When it comes to putting in the new shocks, you will need to take off the adjustment knob at the top. The way that you'll do that is there is a little set screw right here, and the kit comes with a tiny little Allen wrench. So you'll go and you'll loosen that up, and then you simply just pull up and take it off. Once it's back in, you'll then of course put this back on, tighten it back down, and then you can use it to make your adjustments. I'll also mention that whenever you pull the top washer nut and bushing off, make sure that this piece remains on the lower portion, and you'll probably need a hand to be able to do this because someone will need to hold the shock up into the vehicle while someone else goes in through the trunk and puts these pieces of hardware on to secure it in place.
Next is mounting the bottom of the rear shocks, and you'll actually use the rear shock to set the preload for your rear spring. So first you're just going to need to kind of get it lined up to where you can actually bolt it in, and the notch here was a little narrow for the shock, so I had to use a pry bar to get it lined up, but I'll go over the preload setting here in just a second. After taking measurements on all sides, if you need to adjust the height of your coilovers, you'll do it here.
This top ring is going to be your lower spring seat. This ring right beneath it will be your lower spring seat lock ring, and this ring here will be your lower casing lock ring. You do not want to just adjust the lower spring seat ring because it is what is setting your preload for your spring. Instead, whenever you need to make any kind of adjustments, you'll first start by loosening the lower casing ring. If you want to raise the height of the vehicle, you'll then take your wrench and put it on the lower spring seat lock ring, and you would turn it counterclockwise. If you were trying to lower the height of everything, you would take your spanner wrench and put it on the lower spring seat ring and turn everything counterclockwise. After you've made your adjustments, you'll put your lower casing lock ring back into place and tighten it. And then you'll put your wheel back on and double check the ride height. You will probably need to do this more than once and just check and make small adjustments as you go. In the rear, it's a little bit different because we have what is called a divorced spring setup. But don't worry, just because they don't love each other anymore does not mean they don't still love you. But as I mentioned earlier in the video, here is where we are going to actually set the preload for our rear spring. So the way you'll do that is you will loosen this lock ring here, and what that will allow you to do is to adjust the actual shock body in and out of the lower casing mount here. So the more that you rotate the shock body into the lower casing, you're effectively pulling this axle up, and in doing so you're going to start applying some pressure to your spring back there. And what you'll want to do is just to go enough to where you start to feel some pressure applied. And what that's going to do is, if you hit a large bump or something and the whole axle droops down, you won't have your rear spring accidentally fall out because it's always under some amount of pressure. Once you have that preload set, you can actually adjust your ride height with the spring itself. And it's going to be the same thing as on the front.
you will take your spanner wrench, you will put it on the lower ring and rotate counterclockwise to raise the vehicle. You'll put it on the upper ring and rotate it clockwise to lower the vehicle.
Alright everybody, so first impressions with everything. The car definitely feels more planted, you know, when cornering and things like that. It's more intentional and darty, like in a good way. You know, if you point, you go. I do have a couple other like suspension braces and things like that on the vehicle, so obviously that, you know, plays into it a little bit. But those were on the car before now, and it's definitely a noticeable difference in that regard. The one thing that I'm gonna have to keep kind of adjusting or looking at is I had heard that these coilovers were notoriously oversprung and underdamped, and right now I'm experiencing, whenever I go over a bump, I get like some bucking from the rear. It's not so much the actual bounce and rebound recovery that's really noticeable, but with the tune that I have on here and how aggressive the throttle response is, when you hit those bumps, it kind of modulates my foot, and so I kind of exacerbate the issue, because as you're kind of bouncing, you're wah 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 wah, you know, on the gas, and so I'm gonna need to adjust that a little bit. See if I can mess with the preload a little bit more. See if I have it on all the way stiff at the moment. See if I can soften up those shocks and see if that helps out any. Speaking of that, when I was going to put these on and install them, one of the rear shocks I noticed was not responding to the softness and stiffness changes. So one of them, whenever I would change it from one to the other, it would be a noticeable difference in the speed at which it rebounded, and then in the other one it stayed flat regardless of what setting it was on. So I did let MaXpeeding Rods know about that. They did send me a new shock to be able to replace it out, and I tested that one, and that one was performing as expected. So just something to, you know, keep in mind and to watch. You know, it was something that happened to me, but it was also something that they went ahead and made good on. So yeah, car feels good. The other thing, as you can hear, you know, this is not the stock exhaust. It's got cams and long tube headers. No cats, no mufflers. It's too loud, honestly. I'll be doing something at some point to address that. But I mentioned that to say another thing that I noticed is before this install, the U-joint on my steering shaft, down at the bottom wherever it would go into the steering rack, it would sometimes catch on one of the primaries of the long tube headers, and after lowering the car, that doesn't catch anymore. So I don't know if now effectively the steering rack sits closer to, you know, the frame of the vehicle, if everything kind of compressed that way. But that was kind of an unintended side effect, and so that coupled with everything else, with the steering feeling more free, it's very compliant, it's very predictable. I realize I'm saying that for a Mustang, but yeah. So yeah, not exactly something they set out to do, obviously, but if you have had similar issues with clearancing for your long tube headers and your steering shaft, maybe that won't be an issue anymore. So again, everything feels pretty good. They're still new, you know, we'll see how they do after a few months, and I'll see if I can get the rear end to kind of settle in a little bit more with some of those adjustments. But all in all, especially for the money, I can't complain. I feel like it's a pretty good set, and if you're just wanting to kind of get into that game as far as coilovers or lowered vehicle or anything like that, I feel like it's a pretty cost-effective way to do it without a whole lot of investment, and you can kind of dip your toe in the water, so to speak, in terms of setting up a suspension, seeing how the ride changes and all of that. So I give it a shot. Again, for a Mustang at least, you know, there was a few quirks and things with the install, just things that you kind of need to be aware of. I hoped I covered that well enough in the install portion of this to let you not be stranded whenever you're trying to take on the project. So if you're watching this for a different platform, you know, look into the same thing. Make sure that there's nothing that you're going to need to get or also change out when doing this to make sure that everything is set up correctly. But I want to say thank you to MaXpeeding Rods for sending me out this product. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
It goes like